All right, now I want to cover a little bit about function and how this chapter works. And this is going to seem kind of similar, but it's very different in some important ways. And let's go over this. You're going to recognize some of these words like verbs and adjectives and adverbs. Boy, that sounds similar. But subjects and objects and complements, what the heck? What we're getting here with function is an overlap with form. Okay, some of the language is similar. But it's important to know this is what it does in the sentence. So when you're talking about function, you're talking about what it does. So a subject is who or what performs the action. And you're going to have a full verb with an action. You're going to have the helping verbs and the main verb. You have to be able to recognize form in order to get function down. But it's very important to know they overlap with each other. They use some of the same language. With objects, they only show up when you have an action verb, and that's the thing that's acted upon. The complement you're going to see with linking verbs, that's what's going to describe the subject of the sentence. It's going to be another noun or adjective that describes that noun over there, which is the subject. So it's behaving as a subject. So it's important to know that function is what something undertakes and does in a sentence. And you have to understand that they do overlap, but you are talking about two different things, really, that come into contact with each other. And you have to know how they interact with each other, okay? Now, the other aspect you have to know from this chapter that's incredibly important is clauses. And you will have either action clauses or linking clauses based on the sentence, okay, or the type of verb you have. If you have an action verb, you have an action clause. A linking verb, you have a linking clause. But there's three types for what they do, and this is very important. You could have an independent clause. Now, this is the most simple type of clause out there, but it's also the most essential in standard written English. It has a subject and verb, and it can stand alone, and it's up to you to decide if this is a sentence, but you must have the independent clause if it's going to be a sentence in standard written English. You can have a sentence in all types of dialects that are not independent clauses. In most of our spoken dialects, we sometimes use independent clauses, we sometimes don't. But in standard written English, one aspect of a dialect is that all of the sentences can ultimately be boiled down to an independent clause. There's an independent clause in there somewhere. That's going to be the backbone of your sentence. So that is the backbone of it. That's the unit that all the other units are built on. A dependent clause looks a lot like it, but oftentimes if you ever got dinged for a fragment is when you actually wrote a dependent clause. It's got a subject and verb, but it has a subordinating conjunction at the front, like since or if or because. Those have to be attached, you guessed it, onto an independent clause. Because we went to Sam's party, that cannot stand alone. It is a clause, but it can't stand alone as a sentence. Notice you can speak that way. If somebody asks you why, you were late, getting home, and if you said because we went to Sam's party, that would be perfectly acceptable in spoken dialect. But in standard written English, it would be a fragment. Okay, it needs an independent clause. You would say, we were late because we went to Sam's party. Because we went to Sam's party is the dependent clause attached onto we were late. We were late is the independent clause. Notice the backbone of the sentence, on the foundation of it, is the independent clause. The dependent clause is built on top of it. Okay. The relative clause is another subject and verb construction, but it's not a sentence. It starts with who, which, or that. Okay, and it describes a who or a thing or that over there. It really adds onto an independent clause. We went to Sam's party, or because we went to Sam's party is the dependent clause. You can put a relative clause on the end, which ran late. We were late because we went to Sam's party, which went late, or which, took all night. Which took all night would be the relative clause describing the party. So in the end, dependent clauses act as adverbs. Relative clauses act as adjectives. Okay, so that's very important to know. The whole independent clause sets the foundation for the sentence. The dependent clause acts as an adverb to add onto the independent clause, and any relative clauses are going to be used as adjectives because you want to give a little information about this person or that thing. You want to flesh it out more. And again, remember back to chapter 3, the adjectives and adverbs always flesh things out. Well, whole dependent clauses and relative clauses, that's what they do. Okay, so that's very important to know. At the heart of function is the clause. Those are going to be what you're going to build your sentence out of, is ultimately on top of an independent clause, and you can add dependent clauses or relative clauses on them. And do notice at this point that we're not just talking about word, because your brain doesn't work that way. It works in whole clauses, in whole phrases, larger segments of language every moment. That's how you put your sentences together. Okay. So clauses should be thought of as single units that you construct, that you use like bricks to put things together, to put bigger things together. One of the misconceptions I've learned over the years that people have about subjects and verbs is that subjects and verbs are distinct from each other. Okay, one common confusion, very common, is to say who or what the sentence is about is the subject of the sentence. And I'm going to tell you very clearly, no, it's not necessarily. That's the topic of the sentence. That's the topic. So it's not necessarily the subject in a grammatical sense. And the verb is not necessarily an action. And we spoke about that with chapter 8. It could be a linking. So those are misconceptions that people often have about subjects and verbs. Think of subjects as who or what performs the action, or who or what is described. So if you have an action verb, it's whoever is performing that action. If you have a linking verb, it's who or what is being described through that linking verb. So notice the subject is defined by the verb. The verb is defined by the subject. They make a link. They're like spouses. You don't understand that somebody is the spouse of another person unless they are in a marriage. That's what they are. Subjects and verbs are linked together and create clauses. And then you decide, is this an independent clause, a dependent clause, or a relative clause? So don't think of subjects and verbs as separate. Think of them as spouses, that they need each other, that they have to be together in order to make that clause. Okay? And a couple of definitions of sentences. The first two are bad. A sentence has a subject and verb. Not necessarily. If that subject and verb is part of a dependent clause, you have a fragment. Okay? And the other one is a complete thought. Sentence is a complete thought. I hate that definition. It's, because the party ran late, that's a complete thought, and I could verbally tell you that. Okay, and that'd be part of my spoken dialect. But it's not appropriate for a standard written English sentence. So those definitions, which are what most students carry with them in college, are actually misleading. This is going to be more of the operative definition we'll use for this book. A sentence has an independent clause, and you say it is. So to be a sentence in standard written English, you must have an independent clause. An independent clause, because you can have a subject and verb and a dependent clause and you don't have a sentence in standard written English. And relative clauses have subjects and verbs and they're not sentences. So you've got to have an independent clause. But also the other aspect of it, which we'll keep coming back to, is that you say it is. This is very important for writing. And this is the style aspect. One student will say, you know what, I like that independent clause. That's a sentence. I'm going to move on to my next one. Another student might go, you know what, I think I need to give more detail. And you're going to go into more detail on it. That's what a sentence is. Ultimately, it must have an independent clause, but it also has to have your approval. And it's very important to understand that. Ultimately, your writing is up to you. You get to decide if that sentence that you write counts as a sentence, or if you want to expand it, or write it more shorter, or whatever you want to do. As long as you have that independent clause, you've got a sentence in standard written English. Okay? And so that's the notions I want you to get earlier on. Let's jump up a little bit. Okay? And it's important to know there's two basic types of clauses based on the verb. You've got action clauses. The subject is Barry, and what did he do? He spoke. That makes the clause. Okay? Barry spoke are basically linked together. They are one unit. They are a clause. Whether or not you want to call that a sentence or not, it's up to you ultimately. Okay, that can be a sentence. Barry spoke. Barry hit the ball. This is a case when you have a subject, Barry, hit the verb, and the object, the ball. Okay, that's what's called a transitive verb, but intransitive, transitive, don't worry about it too much. But the object, the ball would be the object. So notice with this, Barry is a noun, hit is a verb, the ball is a noun. But Barry is playing the part of subject, hit is playing the part of verb. It is a verb that plays the part of a verb. And the ball is a noun. Okay? Now some people might ask, what is the? Well, the is, if you really want to know what the is, you could look it up in Comprehensive Grammar of the English Language. It's an article. Whatever, it's part of the noun. Yeah, don't worry about it too much. Notice that people don't think about when to use the, they just do or they don't. That's all you need to know. Okay, so Barry is a noun, it is a verb, ball is a noun. Barry is acting as the subject, hit is acting as the verb, the ball is acting as the object. That's what they're doing. Okay, talking about the same words from different angles. That's what we do with chapter 8 and chapter 12. We understand the same basic stuff from different angles. Bear hit the ball to Tim. That gets into indirect objects and all that kind of stuff. That gets a little bit involved. Linking verbs work a little bit differently. Okay. Linking verbs set up a situation where it's A equals B. This complement describes the subject. So the linking verb doesn't do anything. All it does is it links the subject to the description. It's very important to keep in mind with action verbs, you don't have to have an object necessarily. You can or you can't. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. With linking verbs, you must have a complement. If you're going to describe something, you've got to have something and you got to describe it. Okay, that's what linking verbs do. They link up a subject with a description. Okay, and this description is going to be either another noun or it's going to be an adjective. So I could say this book is the Comprehensive Grammar of the English Language. That's noun equals noun. Okay, or I could say this book is blue. The blue describes the book. Is the link. I can't say the book is. That you'd be waiting for something else. Okay. And so, and always understand full verbs as is planning, are squeezing, should be considered, always is an adverb jumping in the middle. Okay, understand your verbs that way. Considered is the action, squeezing is the action, planning is the action. Those are all action clauses. So understand that is planning, are squeezing, should be considered. Those are the full verbs. Okay, and constantly and always, those were adverbs that jumped in the middle. Remember I told you about adverbs are like your little brother. Your little brother jumps in, gets in the way. That's what little brothers do. Okay, so those are how your clause works. Your subject plus your full verb, and you might get an adverb jumping in the middle. That happens. Little brothers do those kind of things. That's how your clause works. Okay, think of your clause always in that manner. And sometimes, again, action verbs have objects, sometimes they don't. So don't worry about if it does make sense. Trust your sense of the language. Okay. This last thing I want to cover is identifying the clause. The ability to do this is what you need to do, especially in the final draft stages, to check to see if you've got sentences, if you really got it, your stuff down. And I ask folks, take a look at this sentence. The fireman extinguished the fire without any problems. You might think And this gets back to that early idea of a topic and a subject and a little bit of a, what is this sentence about? You could say it's about the fire. That, however, is the topic of the sentence. Who or what the sentence is about. And again, I really want to emphasize who or what the sentence is about. It might or might not be the subject of the sentence. I don't like that definition. Okay? I like the subject of the sentence is who or what performed the action. Now, most people could identify the fireman extinguished. That's the subject and verb. And notice they work together. The fireman extinguished. Who did what? It's the subject and verb work together. They make sense. You can't say the fire extinguished. That doesn't quite make sense. But the fireman extinguished, that's a clause. That's the basis of the clause. The fire is the object. Okay? So that is one of the most important things to be able to do is to identify your clauses. And with isolating the subject, and this is important, these are confusing. This is where I see many students trip up and get confused. Ultimately, it's not that tough once you get it down. It's actually kind of like riding a bike. The subject performs the action of the verb if it's an action verb, or it's the part that's linked if it's a linking verb. Now, you might think that the fireman is a subject again. Okay, the fireman, one of the firemen has been taken to the hospital for smoke inhalation, but this is a very important trick in the English language, okay? And this is one of the things that we could blame the French for, but no, probably shouldn't. You will never, ever have the subject of a sentence inside of a prepositional phrase. Of the fireman is a prepositional phrase. That's what it is. So the subject cannot be fireman. You will never, ever have the subject of a sentence inside of a prepositional phrase. Okay? I've looked for so many years and it's never happened that I've seen. If you find a subject of a sentence inside of a prepositional phrase, give me a ring sometime. I would be amazed. It cannot be in a prepositional phrase because that prepositional phrase has to either be an adjective or an adverb. It can't be the subject of a sentence. Subjects of sentences really need to be nouns or pronouns. And in this case, one is the subject of the sentence because it goes with the verb has been taken. And when you step back and think about this sentence, the firemen weren't taken to the hospital. One has been taken to the hospital for smoke inhalation. That's the subject and the verb. So that's why I do insist upon this definition of a subject and verb, that they are linked together. Because if you said fireman as a subject, you would be misunderstanding the sentence. Okay, that's really what it's about, kind of, but that's the topic. That's who or what the sentence is about, but that's not who's performing the verb, who's performing the action or being linked up. Okay, and then the second sentence at the track meet, you might think that the subject is track meet, but no, that's the topic. Okay, or you might think it's runners. That would be a good answer, but it's still wrong. Notice that of the runners is a prepositional phrase. So is at the track meet. Those are prepositional phrases. And if you took out at the track meet of the runners, and if I just told you the quickest won the race, that would make sense to you. The reason is because that's an independent clause. The quickest is the subject of the sentence. That is who won the race. That's who performed the verb. So the ability to take out prepositional phrases is extremely important because the English language is fleshed out. It has so many prepositional phrases. And again, I've gone through books and I've looked at pages and I've crossed out the prepositional phrases. It is often half the page, if not more. English relies heavily in good, detailed, and precise writing on prepositional phrases, but never, ever, ever can a prepositional phrase be either the subject or the verb of a sentence. Never, ever, ever can a prepositional phrase be the subject or the verb of the sentence. They always get cluttered, though, and get in the way. So if you're going to understand, do I have an independent clause here? You must first get the prepositional phrases out of the way, and then the subject and verb will float to the top. It won't guarantee that it'll always make it easy. It will often make it easier. In complicated, sophisticated sentences like this one at the track meet, take that out. Of the runners, take that out. Well, the quickest won the race. It's easy to find the subject and verb now. Okay. Of the play is a prepositional phrase. The first part lasts 20 minutes. Part is the subject. Last is the verb. So it's easier to find the subject and the verb when you eliminate the prepositional phrases because those get in the way. Those function as adjectives and adverbs. They can never function as either the subject or the verb in a sentence. They cannot do it. It just doesn't happen in the English language, okay? So I'm going to hold it there. You now have chapter 12 down. And keep going. If you get down chapters 8 and chapter 12, you've got a very good handle on the English language and how to use it. So make sure you do. If you need to review chapter 8 and go back over the video and read back over the chapter, give it a go. And if you need to review back over chapter 12, give it a go. You probably will never get confused over English again because that is how the English language works in just 2 20-minute videos, and you got it down. That wasn't too bad. Well, maybe it was, but now you got it done, okay? Take care, you guys.